The Haunted Doll, a Terrifying Legacy. Jessica had spent the last few years trying to escape the shadow of her family's old house, but when her grandmother passed away, she inherited the place. Now, after a long, tiring drive, she found herself back in the same town, standing in front of the crumbling Victorian home she once called home. It had been years since she'd been here, and she hadn't exactly been eager to return. The memories were too heavy. Her grandmother had always spoken of the house with reverence, but Jessica had never felt the same. She remembered the strange coldness in the corners, the way the house felt alive somehow. Still, she couldn't bring herself to sell it, so she decided to move in and start fresh, away from her old life. The first day was spent unpacking, going through boxes of old belongings she barely remembered. She wandered through the rooms, sorting things, but each time she passed the attic door, she hesitated. Something about it made her uneasy. She had never spent much time up there as a child, mostly because it always felt wrong. It was as if something watched her from the shadows. Finally, she could put it off no longer. Taking a deep breath, she climbed up the narrow stairs, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. The attic was as dusty and forgotten as she remembered. Shelves full of old furniture, abandoned toys, and family relics filled the dim space. But one thing caught her eye: an old porcelain doll, placed carefully on a shelf in the far corner. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she approached. Curious, Jessica picked it up. It was beautiful in a way, but unsettling. Its cracked face was frozen in a half-smile, and the lace dress was yellowed with age. She ran her fingers along the edges of its face, the cold porcelain sending a shiver down her spine. What a creepy thing to keep in the attic, she muttered to herself, trying to laugh off the feeling creeping up her neck. She placed it back down carefully, but as her fingers left the doll, she heard a faint thud behind her. Whipping around, Jessica saw nothing, just the empty attic. But when she turned back toward the doll, it had moved slightly, its head tilted, as if it was looking directly at her. Shaken, Jessica scoffed, trying to rationalize it. Maybe she had bumped the shelf without realizing. "It's just an old house," she muttered under her breath. "Nothing here is real." But something gnawed at the pit of her stomach, and she couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't alone. The air grew colder around her, and as she turned to leave, she heard a faint sound, like someone whispering her name, soft and distant. It made her freeze. She whipped around again, but the attic was as still and silent as ever. That night, Jessica couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, the wind howling outside her window and the branches scraping against the glass like fingers. The unsettling feeling of being watched gnawed at her. She pulled the blanket tight around her, but no matter how she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every creak of the house seemed to come from above, from the attic, and soon, the footsteps began. Faint, soft steps, too light to be human, moving slowly across the floor. Jessica lay frozen, too terrified to even move. The footsteps came closer, until they were directly above her bedroom. Then, abruptly, they stopped. The silence stretched, suffocating her. And then, in the stillness, she heard it, an eerie giggle, soft and childlike, but too hollow to be real. It echoed through the attic, bouncing off the walls like it was right behind her. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest, and her mind screamed at her to run, but she stayed frozen, barely breathing. Another giggle, followed by the faint sound of a wooden chair scraping across the floor, slowly, like someone was sitting down. Then, the unmistakable sound of the doll's laughter, quiet at first, then louder and louder, as if it was coming closer. Unable to resist any longer, Jessica bolted out of bed and crept down the hallway. The attic door was ajar, and though the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, she couldn't stop herself. She reached for the door handle, but as soon as her hand touched it, a cold gust of air blasted down from the attic. She yanked her hand away, her heart racing. The giggling stopped suddenly, replaced by an unnatural silence. Jessica opened the door, and the cold air rushed out in waves, making her skin prickle. The attic was darker than she remembered. the shadows stretching unnaturally long. Her flashlight flickered as she stepped inside. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight. She scanned the room quickly, and her eyes landed on the shelf where the doll had been. But it was no longer there. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned, scanning the entire attic, and her flashlight landed on the floor at the center of the room. The doll sat there, staring at her, its eyes now glowing faintly in the dim light. But it wasn't in the same position. It was facing her, sitting up straight, its cracked lips curled into a twisted, malevolent grin. Jessica's body went numb. She staggered backward, tripping over something and crashing to the floor. Her flashlight rolled away from her, the beam flickering over the walls, revealing something she hadn't noticed before. Handprints, small, childlike prints, smeared across the walls, leading up to the doll. "I see you," a whisper echoed, but it wasn't from the doll. It came from behind her, as if someone was standing just inches away. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she turned, there was nothing there. The temperature in the attic dropped further. The air felt thick, suffocating. The doll's eyes followed her every move as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. With a desperate scream, Jessica scrambled to her feet and ran for the door. But as she reached the staircase, she heard the unmistakable sound of tiny footsteps running right behind her. Her heart pounded as she reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She yanked and pulled, but the door was sealed shut, as if some invisible force was pressing against it. Her breath was ragged, and the whispers started again. So close, so suffocating, like 1,000 voices crawling into her ears. Suddenly, she felt something cold on her shoulder. She whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat, but there was nothing there. Her legs shook with fear, and her chest tightened. The doll, it was moving. She could see it now, slowly dragging itself across the floor toward her, its limbs stiff and jerky, like a marionette on invisible strings. Its eyes glowed faintly, and as it dragged closer, the giggling began again. Louder, more frantic, until it was ringing in her skull. "You can't leave," it whispered, and Jessica felt a chill spread through her bones. The voice was no longer just an echo. It was real, inside her head, pulling her into the depths of madness. Panicked, she backed away, desperately trying to find an escape. Her hands trembled as she searched the attic for anything that could help her break free. Her eyes landed on the window. It was her only chance. She sprinted toward it. But before she could even get close, the attic door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. A cold laugh reverberated from the walls, but it wasn't the doll's this time. It was much darker, more sinister. Jessica turned to face the doll again, but now it was no longer on the floor. It was standing, tall, almost as if it had grown, its head tilted to the side, its grin widening impossibly. Its porcelain skin cracked, and tiny bits of it fell off, revealing a grotesque, twisted form beneath. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear, sharp, and filled with malice. "I've been waiting for you," the doll said in a low, guttural voice, the words feeling like they were clawing at her insides. The cracks on its face spread like spiderwebs, its eyes now completely black, devoid of any humanity. Jessica could hear a faint humming noise, like a lullaby, and she realized it was coming from the doll's chest. A string, a puppet string. Suddenly, the doll's limbs jerked, and it moved with impossible speed, reaching out with its tiny, clawed hands, grabbing at her legs. Jessica screamed and kicked, but the doll's grip tightened with an unnatural strength, its fingers sinking into her flesh like ice. "No, stop, let go," she cried, frantically pulling away, but the doll's grip only tightened. The humming grew louder, the whispers turned into shrill screams, and the air around her became suffocating, oppressive. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding off her fear, drawing her closer into its dark heart. She looked up one last time, and in the doll's eyes, she saw something horrifying, an endless, empty void. And within that void, hundreds of faces stared back at her, faces she didn't recognize, all twisted in silent screams, faces of those who had come before her. "Now you're part of the collection," the doll rasped, its mouth moving despite its cracked porcelain face. The attic door slammed open, but Jessica couldn't move. She was trapped, pulled into the doll's grasp, her vision blurred, the light from the attic flickering and dimming until all she could hear was the soft humming of the lullaby. The last thing she felt was cold, empty darkness, then everything went silent. The next morning, the house stood eerily quiet. The attic door creaked open, and the wind whispered through the cracks of the old house. On the floor, in the center of the room, sat the doll, its cracked face smiling once again. But now, it wasn't alone. Around it were several more porcelain dolls, all identical, their eyes glimmering in the darkness. Each one sat in a perfect circle around the doll at the center, and though they remained motionless, their tiny heads seemed to tilt in unison as if waiting for something, someone, to join them. The house was once again silent, but its sinister secret remained. The collection had grown,